The Last Deal. Introduction: A Night in Moscow. Moscow in winter is a city of contrasts. The cold bites deep, but the lights of the city are warm and inviting, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered streets. It's a city where power and danger lurk in every shadow, where wealth and poverty exist side by side. In the heart of this sprawling metropolis, hidden beneath its glamorous facade, lies a world that few ever see, the world of the Russian mafia. Ivan Volkov was a man who had seen it all. As a high-ranking member of the Solntsevskaya Bratva, the most powerful criminal organization in Russia, he had spent years navigating the treacherous underworld of Moscow. His name was whispered with fear and respect in equal measure. But Ivan was tired. Tired of the endless betrayals, the violence, the constant threat of death. He had made his fortune, amassed more wealth than he could ever spend, and now he wanted out. But in the world of the Bratva, getting out was easier said than done. Chapter 1: The Offer. It was a cold December night when Ivan received the call. He was sitting in his lavish penthouse overlooking the city, a glass of vodka in hand, when his phone rang. The number was unlisted, but Ivan knew who it was before he even picked up. "Volkov," he said, his voice rough from years of smoking. "Ivan, my old friend," came the smooth, deep voice on the other end. It was Boris Petrov, the head of the Solntsevskaya Bratva, and the most powerful man in Moscow. "I have a job for you." Ivan's heart sank. He had been hoping to avoid Boris's attention, to quietly fade into the background and slip away unnoticed. But it seemed that Boris had other plans. "What kind of job?" Ivan asked, keeping his tone neutral. "The kind that could make us both very rich," Boris replied. "But more importantly, it's the kind that could get you what you've been asking for." Ivan's grip tightened on the glass. He had been asking for freedom, for a way out of the life he had lived for so long. If Boris was offering that, it meant the job was dangerous, possibly even suicidal. "I'm listening," Ivan said carefully. "There's a shipment coming in from Colombia," Boris began. "A very special shipment. It's worth millions, maybe even billions, and it's set to arrive in St. Petersburg in 3 days. But there's a problem. Our contacts in Colombia have gone silent. No communication, no updates. I need someone I can trust to go down there, make sure the shipment gets through, and bring it back to Moscow." Ivan felt a chill run down his spine. Colombian drug lords were not known for their hospitality, and if something had gone wrong, it could mean walking into a war zone. But the promise of freedom was too tempting to ignore. "If I do this," Ivan said slowly, "you'll let me walk away? No strings attached?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Ivan could almost hear Boris calculating his response. "You have my word," Boris finally said. "One last job, and then you're free. But you must succeed. Failure is not an option." Ivan nodded, even though Boris couldn't see him. "I'll do it," he said. "Good," Boris replied. "I knew I could count on you, Ivan. I'll have the details sent to you within the hour. And Ivan, be careful." The line went dead, and Ivan sat in silence, staring out at the city. He knew that Boris's word was worth little, but it was the only chance he had. One last job, and then he could finally leave this life behind. Chapter 2: The Journey to Colombia. The next morning, Ivan boarded a private jet bound for Bogotá. The details of the mission were as vague as they were dangerous. All he knew was that the shipment was something more than just the usual cocaine or weapons. Boris had been tight-lipped about the specifics, which made Ivan even more uneasy. As the plane cut through the sky, Ivan couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. He had been in the game long enough to know that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. But he was in too deep to back out now. The jet touched down in Bogotá in the dead of night. The city was a labyrinth of lights and shadows, with an undercurrent of danger that Ivan could feel in his bones. He was met at the airport by a man named Carlos, one of Boris's contacts in Colombia. Carlos was a wiry man with a scar running down the side of his face, and he didn't bother with pleasantries. "We don't have much time," Carlos said, leading Ivan to a waiting car. "The shipment is being held at a warehouse outside the city. We need to move quickly before the local authorities catch wind of it." Ivan climbed into the car without a word. He wasn't here to make friends. The drive through Bogotá was tense, with Carlos speeding through the narrow streets as if they were being chased. Ivan kept his hand close to the gun in his coat pocket, his eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of trouble. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the warehouse. It was a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a chain-link fence and guarded by armed men. Carlos flashed a signal, and the gate swung open. Inside, the warehouse was a hive of activity. Men were loading crates onto trucks, their movements quick and efficient. Ivan could smell the acrid scent of chemicals in the air, and he realized that this was no ordinary shipment. "What's in the crates?" Ivan asked as they approached the loading area. Carlos hesitated for a moment, then lowered his voice. "Synthetic drugs," he said. "New stuff. Stronger, more addictive than anything on the market. The Colombians have been working on it for years. This is the first batch, and it's worth a fortune." Ivan's mind raced. Synthetic drugs were the future of the drug trade, but they were also highly volatile. If something went wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic. "Is everything ready to go?" Ivan asked, keeping his tone calm. Carlos nodded. "The trucks are loaded, and we're ready to move. We just need your approval." Ivan glanced around the warehouse. Everything seemed to be in order, but his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Let's move out," Ivan said, trying to keep the unease out of his voice. The trucks rumbled to life, and Ivan climbed into the lead vehicle with Carlos. As they pulled out of the warehouse, Ivan kept his hand on his gun, ready for anything. Chapter 3: The Ambush. The convoy made its way through the winding roads of the Colombian countryside, heading for the coast where a ship was waiting to take the shipment to St. Petersburg. The tension in the air was palpable, and Ivan couldn't help but feel that they were driving into a trap. His suspicions were confirmed when they reached a narrow mountain pass. The road was blocked by a line of burning vehicles, and before Ivan could react, gunfire erupted from the surrounding hills. "Ambush!" Carlos shouted, grabbing his rifle and firing out the window. Ivan ducked as bullets ricocheted off the truck's metal frame. He grabbed his gun and returned fire, but it was clear they were outnumbered and outgunned. The ambushers were well trained, and they had the high ground. "We need to get out of here," Ivan yelled over the gunfire. Carlos nodded, and they both scrambled out of the truck, using it as cover as they made their way to the tree line. The other trucks in the convoy were under heavy fire, and Ivan could see men falling, their blood staining the snow-covered ground. They reached the trees, and Ivan paused to catch his breath. The gunfire had slowed, but the ambushers were still out there, waiting to pick them off. "What now?" Carlos asked, his face pale. "We need to get to the ship," Ivan said, trying to think. "If we can make it to the coast, we might still have a chance." Carlos nodded, and they began to move through the trees, keeping low and sticking to the shadows. The sounds of gunfire faded as they put distance between themselves and the ambush site, but Ivan knew they weren't out of danger yet. As they neared the coast, Ivan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw that it was a message from Boris. "Change of plans. Meet me at the safe house in Sochi. Trust no one." Ivan swore under his breath. He should have known that Boris wouldn't play this straight. The whole operation had been a setup from the start, and now he was being pulled into something even more dangerous. "We're not going to the coast," Ivan said, showing Carlos the message. "We need to get to Sochi." Carlos frowned. "Sochi? That's across the Black Sea. How are we supposed to get there?" Ivan thought for a moment. "There's a fishing village not far from here. We can steal a boat and make our way across the sea. It's risky, but it's our only option. Carlos nodded, and they changed direction, heading for the coast. The village was small and deserted, the only sounds the lapping of the waves against the shore. They found an old fishing boat tied to a dock and quickly untied it, pushing it into the water. As they sailed across the Black Sea, Ivan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The night was dark and the sea rough, but they pushed on, desperate to reach Sochi and find out what Boris had planned. Chapter 4: The Final Betrayal. By the time they reached Sochi, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The safe house was an old mansion on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by high walls and guarded by men with rifles. Ivan and Carlos were exhausted, but they had made it. Ivan knocked on the door, and it was opened by a man he recognized as one of Boris's lieutenants. They were ushered inside and taken to a large room where Boris was waiting. "Ah, Ivan," Boris said with a smile as they entered. "I knew you would make it." Ivan didn't return the smile. "What the hell is going on, Boris? That wasn't just a drug deal gone wrong. That was a setup." Boris's smile faded, and he nodded. "You're right, Ivan. It was a setup. But not in the way you think." He gestured for Ivan and Carlos to sit, and they reluctantly did so. "Ivan, you've been in this game for a long time," Boris began. "You've seen things most men wouldn't believe. But you also know that this life comes with a price. And for men like us, that price is often paid in blood." Ivan narrowed his eyes. "What are you getting at, Boris?" Boris leaned forward, his expression serious. "The shipment from Colombia was never meant to reach Moscow. It was bait, to lure out the people who have been trying to undermine the Bratva. There's been a traitor in our ranks, and I needed someone I could trust to help flush them out." Ivan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "And you thought I was the traitor?" Boris shook his head. "No, Ivan. I knew you weren't the traitor. But I needed to make the traitor believe that you were. I needed them to show their hand." Ivan's mind raced as he tried to piece together what Boris was saying. "So, who is the traitor?" Boris's eyes flicked to Carlos, who had been sitting silently beside Ivan. "Carlos was the one feeding information to our enemies. He's been working with the Colombians to take over our operations." Before Ivan could react, Boris's men moved in, grabbing Carlos and dragging him to the center of the room. "You've been a loyal soldier, Ivan," Boris said, turning back to him. "And for that, I'm giving you the chance to prove your loyalty one last time." He handed Ivan a gun. "Finish him." Ivan looked down at the gun in his hand, then back at Carlos, who was now struggling against the men holding him. "Ivan, please," Carlos begged, his voice shaking. "I didn't do it. I swear I didn't betray you." Ivan's heart pounded in his chest. He had been in situations like this before, where loyalty was tested in the most brutal of ways. But this time was different. This time, the weight of all the years, all the bloodshed, and all the betrayals pressed down on him like never before. He raised the gun, his hand steady despite the turmoil inside him. Boris watched him closely, waiting for the shot. But Ivan couldn't do it. He couldn't pull the trigger. He had seen too much, lost too much, and the idea of taking another life, especially the life of someone he had fought beside, was too much to bear. With a sudden movement, Ivan turned the gun on Boris, his finger on the trigger. "You want to know the truth, Boris?" Ivan said, his voice cold. "The real traitor here is you. You betrayed everything we stood for the moment you decided that loyalty could be bought and sold like a commodity." Boris's eyes widened in shock, but before he could react, Ivan fired. The gunshot echoed through the room, and Boris slumped in his chair, a look of disbelief frozen on his face. Ivan dropped the gun and turned to the men holding Carlos. "Let him go," he ordered. They hesitated, glancing at Boris's lifeless body, then back at Ivan. But Ivan's authority was clear, and they released Carlos, who staggered back, his face pale. Get out of here, Carlos, Ivan said quietly. Go as far as you can, and don't look back. Carlos nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and fear. He stumbled out of the room, leaving Ivan alone with the body of the man who had once been his friend. Conclusion: the road to freedom. As the sun rose over Sochi, Ivan walked out of the mansion, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was done with the Bratva, done with the life of crime and betrayal. He had no illusions about what he had done or the blood on his hands. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live a life free from the shadows of his past. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but Ivan was ready. He had made his last deal, and now he was determined to finally walk away, to find a new path, and to start again. With one last look at the mansion behind him, Ivan turned and walked away, leaving the world of the Russian mafia behind forever.